Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the APUS History Curriculum. We ended the last video with the outbreak of war in Asia and Europe in 1939. In this video, we will be looking at topic 7.12, which is a look at the U.S. mobilization for war, both before and after the attack at Pearl Harbor. So let's get to it. First, let's take a look at the U.S. mobilization prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. For the most part, the U.S. wanted to stay out of the war, as evidenced by the various neutrality acts signed in the mid-1930s. But after war broke out in Europe in September 1939, the U.S. began forming a preparedness campaign. For the military, this meant encouraging recruitment, and after September of 1940, the beginning of a military draft. Eventually, between the draft and volunteers, almost 16 million people served in the various branches of the military. Some American pilots ended up serving in volunteer units with the Royal Air Force in the Eagle Squadrons, or with the Chinese Air Force as the Flying Tigers, before the U.S. officially joined the war. But these units were later absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Force in 1942. With the draft also came the need to equip and train all of those soldiers. So the military began a building campaign to create training bases, airfields, and manufacturing centers for arms and ammunition. Many shipyards were also built to accommodate the needed expansion of the United States Navy. And over 60% of all of these facilities were constructed in southern states, mostly due to the nicer weather conditions. The establishment of the War Production Board directed the conversion of factories and industries related to the war effort from peacetime production to war-related production. Because America's factories were unaffected by bombing campaigns, unlike those of Europe, the U.S. was easily able to increase its output capacity. Americans produced about 100,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and the time it took to build a new warship got down to around 14 days. In the Kaiser shipyards in Northern California, workers were literally working around the clock in overlapping shifts. In order to get workers on board, there were agreements between labor and management to pause strikes during the war, contributing to the high rate of production. The War Production Board was also in charge of allocating scarce materials, establishing priorities in the distribution of materials and services, and prohibiting non-essential production. In addition, it oversaw the rationing of commodities which were necessary for the war effort, like fuel oil, metals, rubber, plastics, and paper. Because of the massive investment in production, the number of people in the labor force increased significantly, growing by 20% from 1939 to 1944, while over the same period, the unemployment rate dropped from over 17% to just 1.2%, effectively ending the Great Depression. To protect consumers from excessive price increases, the Office of Price Administration set price ceilings on various products. It oversaw the rationing of consumer goods, including tires, automobiles, shoes, nylon, sugar, gasoline, fuel oil, coffee, meats, and processed foods. At its peak, more than 90% of foods had their prices limited by the OPA. In addition to prices, rents for housing and businesses were also limited in how much or even if they could be raised during the war years. You also saw an expansion of civilian involvement in the war effort, with the creation of state guards to replace National Guard soldiers who would be nationalized and sent overseas, and a civil air patrol which filled a key reconnaissance and search and rescue function. There was even a Coast Guard equivalent called the Coast Guard Auxiliary, which served the same functions. Spotters searching for enemy aircraft were stationed along the coasts and in border states to provide potential early warning of possible attack or invasion. Although oddly enough, there were also participants in the plain states, where no enemy aircraft of the time period could possibly hope to reach. In addition, the United Service Organizations, or USO, was founded at the request of President Roosevelt to provide morale and recreation services to the troops. This brought together several civilian agencies, including the Salvation Army, the YMCA, and the National Catholic Community Service, plus others. Millions of Americans also participated in the war effort by purchasing more than $185 billion worth of war bonds, which were used to finance the war effort. Children purchased victory stamps and exchanged full stamp booklets for bonds, with even well-known figures, like Superman, being used to promote their participation. Finally, the government once again urged Americans to plant victory gardens, using marketing campaigns and celebrities to promote the idea. And Americans responded eagerly, planting gardens in their backyards and vacant lots, and groups like the Boy Scouts even helped to gather recyclable materials to contribute to the war effort. Many women volunteered for organizations like the Red Cross and the USO, among others, and still more found work in factories crucial to the war effort. More than 5 million women joined the labor force during the war, often moving to new communities to find jobs in the aircraft, munitions, and automobile industries. While single women had often worked outside the home, the percentage of married women employed for wages rose almost 25%. Propaganda campaigns urged women to fill the ranks on the nation's assembly line, and their increased wages helped swell family income and paved the way for post-war consumer demand. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter became the symbolic image of women in this industrial workforce. Women also stepped into military roles left by men who'd been shipped overseas. Over 250,000 women enlisted as part of the Women's Army Corps, the Women Appointed for Volunteer Emergency Service, and the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. Many young people also joined the mobilization effort. The number of students in high schools and colleges declined significantly as many chose to leave their academic pursuits and take up jobs essential for the war. Despite continuing issues of racial tension and segregation, about 1 million Black Americans joined the military, some using their participation in the war effort as a way to put race issues on the national agenda. The NAACP encouraged Black Americans to participate in the Double V campaign, which stood for Victory Abroad and Victory at Home. Victory Abroad championed military success against fascism overseas, and Victory at Home demanded equality for African Americans. In some cases, Black Americans were excluded from well-paying jobs in war-related industries, but the Fair Employment Practices Committee helped to bring about an end to segregation amongst defense contractors. Still, military units remained segregated, but many did earn commendations, such as Dory Miller, who earned the Navy Cross for his heroic actions at Pearl Harbor, and the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew in almost 1,600 combat missions and earned 3 Distinguished Unit citations, and much later, a Congressional Gold Medal. Native Americans saw significant gains during the war when the U.S. government approved the utilization of native languages as a radio code for use in the Pacific theater of the war. This initiative originated from Navajo soldiers who thought that their unwritten and little-known language would ensure that critical information could be transmitted securely, even if it was intercepted by the enemy, because it couldn't be understood by anyone except another Navajo. This does mark a significant departure from decades of U.S. government efforts to eradicate Native American culture and language. The Navajo code talkers became highly esteemed within their units, and their code remained unbroken by Japanese code breakers throughout the war. Japanese Americans faced some of the worst discrimination during the war years. Executive Order 9066, issued in February 1942, ordered those of Japanese descent, American citizen or not, to leave an exclusion zone all along the West Coast. More than 110,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to internment camps further inland, even all the way into the Midwest, because the public was paranoid that those of Japanese ancestry, especially those in California, might help Japan by sabotaging U.S. war efforts. Most were given just 48 hours to dispose of their property and belongings. First, there were temporary relocation facilities, such as those in the stable areas of racetracks like Santa Anita. The more permanent camps were constructed in fairly desolate areas across 7 states. Despite harsh conditions, many remained loyal to the U.S., and after 1943, more than 17,000 Japanese Americans joined and fought in the U.S. Army. One Japanese American man, Fred Korematsu, refused to leave the exclusion zone, claiming that the order violated the Fifth Amendment. He was eventually arrested and convicted for violating the order. His appeal eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court ruled that, quote, Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of hostility to him or his race. He was excluded because we were at war with the Japanese Empire, because the properly constituted military authorities feared an invasion of our west coast and felt constrained to take proper security measures. Therefore, the court determined that they should have the power to do just this. Unquote. His conviction was overturned in the 1980s, and the U.S. government finally apologized and made arrangements to pay reparations to those who had been subjected to the incarceration. The mobilization for war meant that still more people began new internal migrations throughout the U.S. People in rural areas sought work in the expanding defense industries and cities, and there was a new round of African American Great Migration leaving the southern states for the cities of the North and West. Another group experiencing a mass migration during this time period were those of Mexican descent. Many Mexican Americans joined the war effort by joining the military. However, many of these people had been employed as agricultural workers. With their mass departure from the fields, there was a shortage of laborers. So a new arrangement was established in 1942 called the Bracero Program. This allowed more than 200,000 Mexican farm workers to enter the U.S. on temporary work permits and assist with planting and harvesting without having to undergo the usual immigration procedures. It also brought in more than 100,000 railroad workers as well, mainly because of the same issues, labor shortages. However, many faced significant discrimination. A significant conflict during this time were the Zoot Suit riots. A Zoot Suit was particularly popular amongst Mexican Americans on the West Coast, and what it is an oversized suit using significant amounts of fabric, which was viewed as wasteful during a time of rationing. This style became a source of tension between the Mexican American community and service members stationed in the Los Angeles area. Tensions escalated, leading to violent confrontation. This conflict turned into a rampage by American sailors around Los Angeles, targeting anyone wearing a suit, regardless of their involvement in the initial confrontation. Service members forcibly removed Mexican American men from businesses of various types, movie theaters, stores, publicly stripping them of their suits to further humiliate them. And when the police intervened, they did not arrest any of the service members, but instead arrested the victims of harassment. Well, that's what you need to know about Topic 7.12, World War II Mobilization. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.